Jocelyn, and I am the consultant for continuing education in small and rural libraries here at the Vermont Department of Libraries. And today's topic is library policies, the trustees' super tools. So our topic for this pair of workshops is policies and what exciting tools they can be to really create a culture and the character of the library in addition to just being regulations. So this came out of a request actually originally from a librarian to have a session where library trustees and directors could have a working session with the Department of Library staff there to sort of coach and consult if needed, because it can be so hard to set aside time for reviewing policies. It's one of those things that we all know is important, but it's not really urgent, and there are other things that take priority over it sometimes because, you know, in the Stephen Covey 4 quadrants where it divides work into priorities, policies is definitely in the category of important but not urgent, so it gets pushed aside, and it's just easy to have that happen. So although that's a great idea to have that working meeting, we can't really do it in a very organic way online. So we're going to save that one for a breakout session next time. We can have an in-person trustee and friends conference. And in the meantime, this pair of workshops this month, this November, we're going to take a look at some big picture mission ideas, goals for the libraries, and then also some specific policy areas, and then give you a chance to work on your own over the next couple of weeks and come back and discuss that process 2 weeks from today. So we have a handout with some sample policies and other related resources that I'll put in the chat and also email to you. And then we also have a template for a schedule of looking at policies. So the Stowe Library has an annual calendar of where they break it down into each month and which policies they're going to look at each month. So they have a regular rotation and can refer back to that. And so they make sure they aren't forgetting any and make sure also just to get to them regularly. So that'll put that in the chat as well. So thinking about big picture, it's a really good time to look at the big picture of your library, the culture that you want for your library. And of course, that is reflected in your policies. So a lot of libraries are analyzing what things they did during the pandemic, what things they want to keep from that time, how their communities have changed. Some demographics have changed a lot in some communities in Vermont. So you have a different population that you're serving, and just people are doing things, people are interacting with information and entertainment in a different way. So just looking at your policies and seeing if it really reflects the current zeitgeist. And then as well as the pandemic, there's also been this just reawakening and about social justice and culture and rethinking of equity and diversity and inclusion, real increased commitment to that in society in general. So it's a good time to think about that in terms of your library policies as well, and see if you feel like they are reflecting the way you want to be approaching issues like that at this point. So at their most fundamental, policies are kind of basic. They explain what the library offers, what are the rules around, the parameters around it, what things are not allowed, and what to do if something goes wrong. But what we really want to focus on today is how they can be much more than that. And again, as I said, the culture of the library and the character of the library, which is going to be different in every town because every town is different, every library is different, and that's part of all the wonderful libraries in Vermont. There are so many of them, and they all have their own strengths and character. So just thinking about things like on your resource list, you'll see the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights. Take a look at that and see if that's being incorporated into your policies, into your mission statement. Think about are there certain populations that are affected more or less by your policies? Are there benefits that are applied to some people more than others, or is it fair? Or can there sometimes be an unintended impact on populations that where enforcing a policy might impact some people more than others and be more of a challenge for some people than others. So just think about that and make sure that's really the direction that you want to be going, and revise it if it doesn't fit what you really want. And then again, thinking about equity, diversity and inclusion, a lot of libraries spend a lot of time on like collection development and reflecting that in having diverse books on their shelves. I think libraries have gotten pretty good at that, and librarians certainly study that a lot, and they think about it a lot and know a lot of resources to find diverse books and think people are thinking more about diverse topics for programs and different presenters. But again, thinking about the policy, is there actually something in writing that expresses that commitment to that? So that's something that you might want to think about at this point, and change it if it's not reflecting what is actually happening at your library right now. So think about if somebody's looking at your library, at your website, if they're thinking about moving to town or applying for a job at your library, can they tell from looking at your mission statement what the character of your library is, what its guiding principles are? So you want to just really overtly express those things. So that's another thing that we're going to focus on today, is that not just doing the work that your libraries probably are already doing, but actually having it codified in policies so that everybody can read it, everybody can have access to it, and it isn't just sort of happenstance. It's actually in the policy that you have certain services and share them in a certain way. So I have a short slideshow I'm going to show of some examples from Vermont libraries and also some other organizations about mission statements, guiding principles, and just as some ideas to get you thinking about that. So I'm just going to pull that up and hopefully successfully share my screen. If somebody can tell me in a second if they are seeing that. I think it did not work. Just a second here. Is that working? Hang on. Sorry about this. Okay, I think now it's going to do it. Fingers crossed here.
We can see it.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so the first example is from the Fletcher Free Library, our biggest library here in Vermont. And hang on a second. I'm sorry about this. So this is in their diversity statement. So as well as having a mission statement, they have a diversity statement. And the very first thing in it is everyone is welcome and you are central to our mission. And I just love that part about being central to the mission. So it's more than just, everybody come into the library, everyone use our services, but everybody is actually a part of creating that mission. And then it goes on to say, we welcome and celebrate a diversity of ideas, cultures, and backgrounds. Diversity includes all ideas and human characteristics that make us unique as individuals: race, ethnicity, gender, geographic origin, culture, lifestyle, age, ability, sexual orientation, economic status, marital status, worldview, and religion, among other characteristics. So that's a lot of things spelled out, but I think that it's just really nice to have that. That's right on their website. So again, if you were looking at would that be a nice library to go to? There's your answer right there. And then they also say how they're responsive and inclusive of our changing community through our staffing, professional and collection development, service provision, and program offerings. So again, just front and center, and actually part of their policy. So moving on to another library that I really liked, these value statements from the Jocelyn Memorial Library in Waitsfield. I did used to work there, so I might be slightly biased, and that is also why my dog is in that picture, but that's really not what we're here to talk about today. But what I love about this is that they have a stated commitment to working collaboratively and to moving the community forward. So I do know, because I'm just very familiar with that library, how much they work with the other libraries in their region and other organizations in their town. But again, it's not just because they happen to be doing that or they happen to have somebody who's interested in doing that. It's actually in their value statement that they're going to do that. Another really nice thing about this one is that being passionate and having fun is forefronted. It's not an afterthought. That actually is part of their values. And then a really great thing that really creates a culture of an organization is this part about valuing staff and volunteers as their greatest resource. So recognizing that, putting it in writing. And so again, that's going to continue no matter who the staff is, no matter who the trustees are, they've actually have created a culture and put it in writing. And that shows a very strong commitment to that. Here's a couple examples from other fields. The Burlington City and Lake Semester is a program for high school students in Burlington. And there's a lot of words on this one, but and you can look at it more closely later. But I just really like this one, the number of times the word community is used, because that's very transferable to libraries. And also in the last bullet, libraries could say that same thing. You know, we incorporate diverse perspectives into the projects and experiences. In this case, it's for the students, but this could be for your community members. Your programming could reflect that. So again, a lot of libraries are doing this, but I just really like the idea of putting it in writing. This is another one, as an arts organization. And one of the things I love about this that I also think is pretty applicable to libraries is that meaning and joy and connection are right there in their value statements, because we all know those are things that are very important to libraries. And so putting something like that in writing that everybody can see. And then circling back to libraries, a couple examples of library mission statements. The Stowe one, very short, simple: welcome to inspire, enrich the mind. And then Greensboro's, I really like about this one is it says it has community right there in the very first sentence. So again, just showing that these things are commitments, and they're enough of a commitment to put into writing. So another thing about these that I think is pretty cool is just how many verbs there are in this. So I thought a fun thing to do might be to just while I'm stopping presenting, if you can just throw some ideas in the chat about verbs that you might want to have incorporated into your mission statements. It could be engage, energize, excite, inspire, like the Stowe one has. So just think about that, because again, if you have active verbs, then you're more likely to get people's attention with it. So love to see what people think about that. Again, empower is one that I've seen in some library mission statements, which is a very cool word. Honor, nurture, enrich. So if people can just have any ideas, we'd love to see those. So then we're going to move on just in a minute here to some more specific policies, and just give some thoughts about that. But before we do that, a couple other thoughts. Again, about the equity, diversity, and inclusion. There are some organizations that have a separate policy for that. But that sort of pulls it out and makes it like its own special thing rather than incorporating it into everything. I really like it when policies incorporate that aspect into everything that they're doing, because we really need to be thinking about that in all of our library services. And so putting that into the policies will help with that. And then, of course, the thinking about if policies are enforced consistently, because if they aren't, then they could be the best policies in the world, but they're still not really going to meet the goals that you have for them, because they're going to be applied to some people in different ways than others. So just think about that. And then along those lines, they need to really be somewhere that everybody can see them, so everybody knows what they are. So it isn't something that just the trustees and the staff know about, or some of the patrons that really spend a lot of time. It really need to be in print, where people can look at them at the library if they want to, and on the website, and accessible. So shared in a way that everyone can see them. And speaking of accessible, we are going to move on to Karen. Now is going to speak some about accessibility policies.
Thank you, Joy. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen, and we'll see how that works out. So for those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Karen Gravlin. I am the library consultant for Inclusive Services, and I'm also the director of the Able Library. And it's showing for me. Can you guys see the PowerPoint? Awesome. Let's see. So as Joy mentioned, library policies they're pretty much guidelines and expectations. When I was running my own library, I used them to set expectations for myself, my staff, and also for patrons so that they knew what to expect when they were coming into the library. Essentially, what they do is they help make sure that the library is running smoothly. And they also helped ensure the safety of staff and patrons. So from a day-to-day operational level, policies are super important in that regard. But having worked in libraries for a while, I started to think about how library policies and the application of those policies, they end up setting the tone and creating the culture of a library. So you can get a pretty good idea if you think about, when you walk into a business or an organization, you kind of get an idea of what their values are based on the policies that they have. One that I was thinking of was in a restaurant. It's pretty easy to figure out if young children are welcome at a restaurant if you walk in and there are high chairs or booster seats available. If not, the message is that that business doesn't serve that demographic. And it may be that the restaurant owners or managers don't have children, and so they just didn't think of it. It didn't even occur to them. Or they might actually believe that the dining experience is ruined when young kids are involved and it was an intentional decision. But the lack of high chairs may not have stemmed from a specific policy that was consciously adopted, but the end result is the same, and that end result is the message that customers are left with, which is that young children don't belong in that restaurant. In the same way, there are really subtle ways the policies, the lack of policies, or how we apply those policies can exclude certain groups of people. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and look at all of our policies from a lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I'll refer to as EDI going forward. But not only that, but it's important to get staff on board, as Joy said, and train so that everyone understands the intent behind your policies and how to apply them appropriately across the board. Even policies that you don't think are exclusionary should be looked at. And when you do that, you may find that updating policies with EDI in mind can help you create a welcoming space, not only for your patrons and community, but also for your library staff. Creating a welcoming space for a diverse community can help facilitate creating a welcoming space for a diverse staff. And so one of the ways that you can go about looking at policies through an EDI lens is to look at your underserved populations in your community. So I'm going to pause for a moment so that we can talk about what underserved populations are. Traditionally, when we're talking about underserved populations, we're referring to people of color, LGBTQ folks, seniors, veterans, incarcerated individuals, people with low incomes, new Americans, people with disabilities, people who are homeless. I mean, I could keep going on with all of the groups that have been historically marginalized, but you can identify other underserved populations in your community just by asking yourself a couple of questions. Who isn't coming to the library, and who aren't we reaching? So when we're looking at library policies from the perspective of underserved populations, the next question becomes why? So why are these groups, whomever you've identified, not coming to the library? Is it that the hours the library is open aren't convenient, or is it that they don't think the library has books or other materials that they would be interested in? Is it that the current library programs don't meet their interests, or maybe they can't even get into the building? So once you can answer why, the next question to ask yourself is, which library policy, if any, does this fall under? And that's when you start to get to the meat and potatoes of how library policies, or a lack of a policy, can unintentionally exclude certain groups of people. Thankfully, on the other side of that, by examining those policies, we can hopefully start to see how to create or reinforce a welcoming and inclusive culture through those policies. So one example I'm going to use is a patron conduct policy, specifically no cell phone policies. Working in libraries, I've found this policy to be strangely controversial. So if you decide to do away with a no cell phone policy, there will be some patrons who will be upset, just a fair warning. But in this instance, in my example, the underserved group that I'm thinking of is people with low incomes. So imagine this scenario. A low-income patron comes into the library to use the public computers because he doesn't have one at home and doesn't have internet access. And so he's starting a new job, and his employer wants him to fill out some forms online before his first day. So he's trying to fill out those forms, and he can't figure out how to do it. The staff try to help him, but they can't figure it out either. So he needs to call the employer and have them walk him through filling out that form. But he can't do that because the library has a no cell phone policy. So in this case, staff might make an exception, right? Because it's an important phone call. He clearly needs the help. But there are several issues with doing that. So first of all, what about the patrons who didn't even bother coming to the library to use the computers because they knew that there was a no cell phone policy, and they didn't know that staff would make an exception for them, or they were too embarrassed to ask. And then the other issue with that is putting library staff in a position where they have to decide if the patron's need is important enough to make an exception to the policy. So that gets into the issue that Joy was talking about, where we're talking about equitable application of policy. And so it's not really fair to ask staff to be put into that situation where either there is no policy or the policy is not clear enough. They know they can make exceptions, but it's up to them to decide when. And so that's just one example of how policies can make people feel unwelcome in the library and can unintentionally keep certain groups within your community from using the library. So the solution may be just revisiting current policies and revising them to reflect the kind of library community you're trying to build or strengthen. But how can policies make people feel welcome? So when I think of a welcoming policy, it's a policy that formalizes the goal of creating a safe, welcoming environment at the library. It lets patrons know that the library is a space that's meant for them and that they'll find relevant materials for their needs and interests, and that they'll be safe while doing so. And there are many examples of welcoming library policies. Joy mentioned a couple, like collection development and programming policies, equitable open hours, but the one that I'd like to focus on just briefly is accessibility policies, because I don't think it gets enough attention. Accessibility policies are important because, number one, it makes patrons with disabilities feel welcome in the library. So if you think back to the restaurant example I gave, having high chairs in a restaurant, it immediately signals to customers that young children are welcome. And in a similar way, an accessibility policy can let patrons with disabilities know that they're welcome at the library just by showing patrons that they've been thought of and that the library will work to make sure that they have as much access as anyone else in their community. Two, as I discussed earlier, policies help set expectations, and this is no exception. So it lets your staff know what they're supposed to do when they're serving a patron with a disability. And as Joy mentioned, it lets the patron know what to expect when they come into the library and what kind of service they can expect to receive. And lastly, it's a policy that I think can benefit everyone, and I'll circle back to that. Having an accessibility policy, it doesn't have to be its own policy. South Burlington Public Library includes it in their library use policy. And it just says that the library adheres to the Americans with Disabilities Act to meet the needs of library users. So it's one sentence, but it encourages staff to rethink how they're providing services and whether they're accessible to everyone in the community. And it also lets patrons know that the library is going to work with them to ensure that they're able to have access to those library services. One of the aspects of an accessibility policy that I think is really powerful is how this policy can end up benefiting everyone, not just people with disabilities. Probably the most well-known example of that is the curb cut effect. So curb cuts, they're ramps to go onto the curbs or cutouts that make the sidewalk more accessible. And they were initially lobbied for by disability advocates, so that people with wheelchairs or low vision would have an easier time going up the sidewalks. But when curb cuts became more widely available, it became apparent that lots of people were using them. Think about how convenient they are for parents with strollers or people pushing heavy carts, people with luggage, people on bikes or skateboards. I also think of automatic door openers for wheelchair accessibility. Those have been helpful to me on so many occasions. Again, when you have a stroller, when your arms are full of books, it's easy to just push that button and the door opens. And so it's not just for people with disabilities, but it improves access for everyone. So if having an accessibility policy encourages you and your staff to make the library building, programs, and materials as accessible as possible to the patrons with disabilities, you may find that the policy unintentionally benefits others. So making the library building and services more accessible can end up improving everyone's experience. So that's the end of my portion. So thank you all, and I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan now and try to stop presenting.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. And I'm going to touch on a lot of the same things and some of the same things that Joy touched on as well. So let's see if I can share. Can you see that?
We can see
Yes.
it.
Okay, good. Because now I can't see anything except that. So when considering library policies for youth, we are going to start with one line from Joy reference with the ALA's Library Bill of Rights, which I encourage you to read through if you haven't. It's quite dense, but there's also, ALA has a lot of resources, including they have a page that sort of breaks it down specifically for youth and other groups. So a person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, or views. So the right to use a library includes free access to an unrestricted use of all the services, materials, facilities the library has to offer. Every restriction on access to and use of library resources based solely on chronological age, apparent maturity, education levels, literacy skills, emancipatory, or other legal status of users violates this. And so in thinking about that, you're thinking about policies that, any policy that has to do with youth, then you're talking about ages, whether that's 0 to 17, whether you have, if there's teen specific, if there's school age, if there's 0 to 5, you are, anytime you are making policies that are using that, you should be very thoughtful about who, any policies in regard to that, about who that might be limiting access to. Like with youth, you'd also want to think about youth that are experiencing homelessness, which might be something that, if you think about your policies around library cards and parental signature and also around unaccompanied youth, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, you really want to think carefully about who that might be excluding if you have very specific rules around that. So effective library policies. This is something from it's called Project Ready, and it's really fantastic. It's from the University of North Carolina, and this was just something I thought was really great. Is that it's a great way to look at policies, and it is through an equity lens. As was discussed, that really everything should be, whether you have a specific EDI policy or really it should just be built into every policy. And so they should be context specific. You should know your community. Think about the policies, what works for one library may not work for your library or apply to your library. So you really need to assess your community, what the needs are, and work from there. And then the policy should be explicit, as we discussed. I really like Karen's example of the restaurant, and the same thing happens in the library. You walk into a space, there's often actual signage that tells you what you can and can't do, but there's also just a physical space that whether you can, if there is a automatic door, or whether there is, seating in a particular area, whether it is a teen area or not, whether those are explicit policies or not, they are affecting the users who are coming in. And the policies around youth should be collaborative, and if possible, especially when talking about policies around teens, should include youth, and especially BIPOC youth when possible, should be involved in creating those policies. And of course, any policies that involve youth should be youth-centered, and they should be compassionate, which I really like. And that sort of comes back to the words that when Joy was talking about the verbs, that being compassionate, thinking about, again, if a policy, especially if it is saying you can't do this, who is that excluding and why? So just going to touch on, I just have some very, very basic slides of just a few things that might come up. There might be policies specifically around youth. So one of them is privacy, which can be a little tricky, especially for youth. But again, going back to the Library Bill of Rights, all people, regardless of origin, age, background, or views, possess the right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. And this includes students and minors who have a right to be free from intrusion and surveillance. Again, those are things to consider. It can be tricky in thinking about children and what they can and can't access. And there are a lot of very specific policies at libraries that talk about that, but it really is not the library's job to decide what a child or a teen can access. And that is something that is a parent or guardian would be responsible for that, and it's not the library to be making those choices. So another area that comes up is restrictions and fines. So this obviously typically applies to all patrons, to all users, but especially fines can especially affect youth. And especially when there are times when if a family is not able to pay the fines, then those can really add up. And for a child especially, that can really affect them not wanting to use the library, and it may down the road affect those who may be lifelong users. So there are, when I was working at New York Public Library, which has now gone completely fine-free for everyone, but they also several times alleviated all fines for youth for this exact reason. So that is something to consider. And then a big one that comes up is unaccompanied minors. As there are a lot of different policies around that, around which age. I've seen very specific policies that say, if they're under age 10, they must be accompanied by an adult. But again, when you're doing that, really be thoughtful, because if there is a 17-year-old who has a child, then you're excluding them if you're saying that that child can't be with their parent, you know, that is, you're excluding that patron. Or if they, or you are diminishing, and we'll talk about teen policies here in a second, but also the fact that a child might be coming into the library with a teen, with a sibling. So you need to be very thoughtful about those policies and who they're affecting again. So again, so there's overlap with that. And there are, specifically with teen policies, there are libraries that feel like they don't serve teens. They are not able to get teens into the library, which can be a challenge. And that's one thing that you can, again, that was brought up earlier, of like looking how you could bring them into the library, but also there often are issues around teens being teens and being, in some cases, pushed out of the library or pushed into certain places or being excluded in certain ways. And so there should be very thoughtful policies around all of that. And then very quickly, also school visits is kind of a specific thing, is that, and I've talked to several librarians who have had issues around school visits, just thinking about policies, about how that works when they come in. Are the students using their own cards? Are they using an educator card? So that you know how those work, and so that, and as was mentioned, with everything around youth as well, everyone needs to be on board, all staff. It's not just none of this should just fall on the youth services person, if there is a youth services person, but everyone should be involved and know every policy and be implementing them in the same ways in regards to youth. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. And then I am going to turn it over to Gary Diziel.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm going to start sharing. I've never been very good at sharing, but I'm going to try. And thank you, Joy and Karen, Jonathan. You can see this, I hope?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. So I'm going to go through here pretty quickly. I'm going to be talking, I'm Gary Diziel. I work for UVM Extension. And here's my contact information. If you have any questions through this, you can throw them in the chat, and they will be codified for all time so that we can respond to them later. And I've got a bunch of cutout figures, people helping me along with this presentation. But, and if I can get it to go forward. Okay, so I'm going to be specifically talking about human resource, HR policy. And a lot of the things that Joy and Karen and things that Jonathan have introduced, like the Project Ready about effective policies, you know, what they should be, and Karen talking about accessibility policies help everyone and how you can integrate that into all policies, EDI or DEI into HR is fantastic. And Joy said policies can be much more than what's allowed by regulation and law, or something to that effect. But of course, trustees have the full power to establish library policy. We know that, and a reminder that policies, going back to what Joy said, first, there's a few reasons why you have policies, right? They ensure that laws and regulations are followed, but also, and more importantly, they guide behaviors, right? You connect policies with your values, with your mission, and with your vision. And they also codifies practices for volunteers as well as employees. So we're talking about HR policy now. There are basically two different types of libraries, as you know, in Vermont. There's incorporated, which are nonprofit corporations, as well as municipal libraries. And regardless of the type of, there's community libraries too, don't want to leave them out. And but whatever kind of public library you are, you need a personnel policy. So, to each their own. So if you're an incorporated, you are on your own. You're your own corporation. You're on your own with policies and procedures. If you're a municipal library, you can choose two paths. You can adopt town policies, or you may create your own. To go a little further, I'll just stay there for a second. If incorporated, of course, there are a lot of examples, and so you are not alone. You know, you're not starting from square one. So in both cases, if you wanted to create your own human resource personnel policy, you're not alone. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about municipal libraries. And I've worked with municipal libraries that have developed their own personnel policies, and I've worked with municipal libraries who have adopted town policies. I will say that I forgot to say I'm also a trustee of a public library in Georgia, and we have an HR policy, personnel policy. We've totally used the towns. We do not have our own personnel policy. So if you develop your own policy, just know that it will be different than the town, and the differences may cause distractions. And there's a lot of things to think about when you're doing an HR policy. I'm not going to be talking about specific things in an HR policy. There are plenty of resources, including the handout that Joy has prepared for everybody. And you'll get a copy of this through Joy, this presentation. But just as an example of when you're responsible for an HR policy is that the Crime Victim Leave Act, Act 184, took effect July 1st, 2021. Marijuana in the workplace also took effect July 1st. This is in Vermont. And Vermont wage and hour rules are pretty extensive. Examples are, you know, who has the right to military leave? What about nursing mothers? What about earned sick time? What about sexual harassment? The theme through this has been equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so you have to know about the laws that we've put up in Vermont and that are federally there, like the Civil Rights Act, like the Americans with Disabilities Act. All these things guide us on what we need to do to follow regulations and be within the law. And those are really, really important in ensuring equity, diversity, and inclusion, or at least helping us towards that in a personnel policy. Other things that I wanted to point out, what municipal libraries may want to become familiar with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. They have a municipal employment law handbook, and it's available at their website. And also, if you are developing your own HR policy or personnel policy, then I would strongly suggest a labor attorney take a look at that before it's finalized. And you may speak with your town administrator, see if you have access to the town attorney to look that over as well. As I noted in the beginning, that there are a lot of examples available, and you'll see some links in this presentation when you have it in PDF form, and also the handout that Joy has created, or Joy, Karen, and Jonathan and I have created that Joy will share with you. So there are a lot of examples. If you had any specific questions about any HR policy, personnel policy, I am available to answer those questions. And we wanted to move along so that we would have plenty of time for you to ask questions. So one of my cutout helpers here is saying this is the end of it. I'll hand it over back to Joy.
All right, thank you, Gary and Karen and Jonathan. And we're going to move into Q&A. Please feel free to type in the chat if you have questions or comments. I want to start with Nancy. You've had your hand up almost the whole time. So Nancy, if you want to unmute and share if you have a question. I'm not sure if you still do, because it has been up for a while, but there wasn't really a good time to get to you. So Okay, we haven't heard from Nancy. So let's just open it up to anyone, everyone. If you have questions, if you're on the phone and want to unmute yourself, you can press *6. Just leap right in if you're on the phone, because I know you can't write in the chat, but any comments, questions?
This is Janet, the Grand Isle Library. I do have a question. Just putting it out there to hear what other libraries do for unattended child policies. We're right now working on that with the trustees to determine the appropriate age at which, I guess it just depends on different communities. I do know some libraries do 8 years old and up, and others are 12 years old and up. And I kind of was just wondering what other libraries are doing, just so we can hone down when we have our next trustee meeting to figure out our unattended age policy. And also a side question to that would be, at what age do most libraries allow a child or a young adult to have their own library card, just in their name and not tagged on to their parents? I will mute myself right now. Thank you.
So an efficient way to do that might be if people could write in the chat, just to answer Janet's question about if you know the age that your library has for unattended minors.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I've definitely seen various ages at libraries.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and certainly something people have to consider. Lauren, would you like to share a question?
Yeah, thanks. So my question was, I heard talking about value statements, and of course we know about vision statements and mission statements, but then also getting into the nuts and bolts of general policies. I was just curious from your collective expertise, if we were starting a library from scratch, what would be the first policies we should really hone in on? What policies should we have? I mean, not everybody has an EDI policy, for example. What would be kind of the core policies that you would recommend we work on?
Excellent question. We actually have a handout of that, of the essential policies, because you're absolutely right. Not every library is going to have every policy. I would say, and I don't know if Gary would agree with this, but personnel would be like a really good, you absolutely have to have that, because you need to be, your staff needs to know what to expect, and you need to be treating them well, because everything else kind of stems from how they are able to do their jobs. Obviously, you need a circulation policy. That's, you can't circulate things unless you have parameters around that. Collection development, you need to have a policy for if somebody challenges any of the materials that you have in your library. So there should be a written form for that, and staff should be trained, or at least the staff should be trained to hand that one off to the director probably. But if the only staff is the director, they need to be sure that they know how to use that form and that people are aware of the form. And what else? Others want to leap in here?
Joy, this is Gary, and I agree with you. And it's an interesting question. If you start a library from scratch, you'll probably end up with a suite of policies which are amazingly fantastic, because to stand up a business, you're going to have to be very thoughtful about what you're doing. So it's about the customers, and it's about your people. I mean, your people are the most important resource, but the customers are certainly very important. So boy, it's hard to say what you don't do, because organizations end up with quite a few policies that are really, when you start thinking about what customers can do or what customers are able to do and what you'd like to have, your values, it really, you can't really eliminate some, you don't want a computer policy when you start out. You can work on that later. You sort of have to have it all together. But HR, I'd have to agree with Joy.
You also have to have policy about who can use the library. Some libraries are open to everybody. Some libraries are more strict about it's only open people that pay taxes and support the, that live locally and are part of the local tax base. And then if you are that library but want to allow people to buy cards, then you have to think about how much you want to charge for someone from out of town to have a card at your library.
And I'll just add in that not all libraries have equity, diversity, and inclusion policies, and you don't necessarily have to, but you should be looking at each of your policies and seeing how they're affected by equity, diversity, and inclusion. So when you're looking at your circulation policy, how is that policy, either excluding certain groups or discriminating against certain groups? So that's just one way to think of it, so that you don't necessarily have to have a specific policy in place so much as it is that you're using the framework of EDI to inform how you work on all of your policies.
If I could add just something to Karen, is that also in the procedure, like how you hire somebody isn't in a policy, but a procedure should include equity, inclusion, diversity. And I often think of benefits in libraries, and like that's like the most powerful equity thing you can do is to offer benefits, retirement, health insurance, that sort of thing, outside of the wage. So just wanted to add that. Thanks, Karen.
I'm so glad you said that, Gary, because there's a lot of talk in the profession about trying to diversify the profession. And if the wages aren't high and if there aren't benefits, so often library jobs default to somebody who's partnered with somebody who has a better paying job or benefits, and because the wages are just not enough to live on and to plan for retirement. And so I know that that's sometimes you can't like suddenly increase the budget of your library, but if the profession is going to be diverse, it has to look at that question. And I think that's historically, it was often married heterosexual white women that were in these professions, and it doesn't, that's not the way we want the profession to look anymore. So just really important point about the benefits. Paula, would you like to share something?
My question, because of things I've dealt with recently, is if other libraries have policies for use of the library building outside of library hours by other groups, by individuals, by all the people in town who happen to have a key. I'm starting to think we need a policy, and I would love to see examples.
You do need a policy on that. And I don't think I included any of the examples of that on the handout, but there are some on our website, and I can probably pull this up right now and find them and put that in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we appreciate all those who chimed in too about sharing policies around unattended youth and library cards for youth.
Deborah, would you like to share your question?
Sure. My question is, from other people's experience, if you're going to start building, some of these policies that we don't have, what is the best way to start? Is this sort of something that should be staff driven? Should it be board driven? Should it be a combination? What seems to work best, if anybody has any advice on that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I feel very strongly that the staff, and especially the director, should be involved in policy making, because they are in the library all the time, and they are, they're interacting with the people, they're interacting with the current policies, and they can tell whether they're working well or not in a way that the trustees might be, somewhat more removed from. I also do think you don't want to crowdsource, I don't think, your policy creation, but feedback from the community would be great if you could gather that, just as about something like hours, for example. Like there's you need a lot of feedback on that because people have different needs around that. So maybe build it into like strategic planning where you're doing community assessment anyway, not necessarily specifically polling your community about what they think the policies should be. But if you can gather some of that information about what their needs are in another context, you certainly would want to be applying those to policies. Other thoughts?
I'd just like to add in, as far as getting staff involved in helping you create policy, that also helps staff have buy-in, so that if they're the ones who are helping to create the policy, then they're going to be more likely to embrace that policy and enforce it in the library and feel like they're helping to create the culture. So I also am an advocate for having staff involvement.
That's a really good point. That's absolutely true. Get that, have that buy-in, because we sort of, I think we all hit on that, of that even once policies have been created, they're not necessarily always implemented the same way by staff, and part of that is that there is that familiarity and that buy-in to those policies.
I think it's really important that the staff realize too that even if they don't agree with a policy, they should be enforcing it, because like Jonathan had mentioned, sometimes the youth, especially teens, are not treated the same way by the staff that's not the youth services staff, and it doesn't matter. Like if you happen to be an adult services librarian and get grumpy when teens are loud, you still need to follow the policy for so that's just one example, but it's just really important, again, for consistency and keeping the policies enforced consistently. Paula, your hand, I think, is your hand still up, or is it up again? I couldn't tell, or maybe not. Okay. Yeah, Paula, I can't tell if your hand is still up or.
Sorry, that was my mistake.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we are actually almost out of time. I just want to go over quickly what we're going to do 2 weeks from today. So the idea was that you had a little bit of homework for this, and you don't, of course, have to do it. But if you want to take any ideas that came up today or other things you've been thinking about, and take some time in the next couple of weeks to work on some policy revision or some mission state revision, and then come back in 2 weeks and talk about that with us. We'd love to hear, like, what were there things that you looked at and at least seemed fine? These are contemporary. We can check this one off. We're good on this one. Or there were things that you felt really needed to be updated or changed. And what was that process like? Was it hard to come to consensus amongst the board? Did the director and the trustees see eye to eye on that? And if not, how did you sort of work through those things? And how, if you're looking at examples from other libraries, which ones seem to resonate and feel like they'll work for your library and which might not? A lot of things that come up, in Vermont is there's such a range of size of libraries, and sometimes there'll be something that works for Burlington and just doesn't work at all in a small town. So then that's okay, as long as it's fair and it works for your community and you all agree and commit to it. It doesn't have to be the same. So just think about that, which are the examples that are helpful for you, and which may not necessarily be relevant to you. So I'm just going to add a couple things in the chat, so try to catch these links, and I'll email them to you as well. But we do have a handout of resources about policies. I'll put that in here. That is the handout, and that has a couple links on it too, to other things that we talked about. And then there's also, this is the review schedule, a template for that, just a calendar year with policies divided up into when you might look at each one. And then hopefully you'll all come back 2 weeks from today, same time, 1 o'clock on November 15th. But in case you don't, during an evaluation, a link to a short evaluation for the workshop in the chat as well. And I think that's about all we have for today. So again, if you get a chance, look at some policies and come back and discuss with us, and come back, and even if you didn't get a chance to actually rewrite anything, we'd love to talk to you about the process of it. And also, I know we touched on a lot of things quite quickly today, so happy to revisit any more questions you have or things you've thought about after stepping away from this a little bit. And also, I think the last thing is thank you for coming. And thank you for being trustees and library staff.
Thanks, everybody.